Well, it's been a while. It's good to be back in front of a camera and in a new space that I'll show you more of another time. I'm actually no less busy now than I have been recently, but there's just no way that I couldn't make a response to a video I saw attempting to show that the Bible doesn't support slavery. So I've taken some time to respond here and demonstrate not only that the Bible does support slavery, but that attempts to prove otherwise are almost always based on a lack of understanding about the context of certain biblical verses. The guy in this video is about to list off a whole host of biblical proofs that slavery was condemned by the God of the Old Testament, and I'm going to show why each and every one of them don't quite say what they might appear to say at first. But just before that, I want to take a moment to let you know that my good friend Steve from the YouTube channel Rationality Rules is currently running a Kickstarter for a card game that he's created called, fittingly, Debunked. He brought a prototype to Oxford recently, and I think it's a genius idea. You take a deck of cards with religious arguments on them, like the watchmaker analogy, for instance, and you turn one up. Then the players from their own hands have to play the correct logical fallacies to debunk the argument on the table. And there are trump cards, like the divine right card, allowing you to steal from someone else's hand. Essentially, it's a highly strategic game that can teach you about logical fallacies and how they can be used to debunk fallacious arguments and have great fun while doing so. The Kickstarter has been immensely successful and the project can only improve, so if you want to support it, and there are a bunch of benefits for doing so, then check out the link in the description. It's only got a few days left, so go and see if it's something that you want to support while you still have the chance. Or if you're watching this in the future, go and get the game. Okay, so on to the video.
Hey everyone, my name is Alan Parr. Thank you all so much for visiting my channel. Here on The Beat, we release a new video every single Tuesday, and today we are answering the controversial and many times misunderstood question, does the Bible support slavery? And so what I want to do is I want to give you 7 facts and show you how slavery in the Bible was very different than the slavery that was practiced in our country.
So this should be our first cause for concern. The video begins by suggesting that we're about to hear an argument that the Bible doesn't support slavery, and yet we're now being readied for, instead of, here is proof, unequivocal proof that the Bible condemns slavery, rather something more like, well, slavery is supported in the Bible, but it's a special kind of slavery that isn't all that bad. Obviously, this hasn't been explicitly said yet, but I want you to pay attention to the language being used here. Consider this question throughout the video. Are we being offered proof that the Bible does not justify slavery? Or are we being offered an excuse for the fact that it does?
Number 1, God did not create slavery, but rather He regulated it.
Okay, would it be cheap of me to point out that Christians believe themselves to be in absolute subjection to the divine, and so yes, God literally did invent slavery, himself being the first and eternal slaver of mankind? Perhaps, but it's an important point. God did in fact invent the concept of the ownership of human beings, since he himself has an absolute right and authority over our lives. This is, of course, not the kind of slavery being discussed in the video, but if anything, this even more undeniable type of slavery propagated in the Bible is even worse than the kind apparent in the slave trade. At least when owned by a human being, there's always a chance of redemption, changes in the law, escaping to freedom, or at the very least death, if it's decided that no life is better than one spent in bondage. This is all possible in something like the slave trade. Not so much with the ownership of human beings by God. There is no escape. There is no chance of a change in the law. There is no appeal, and there is no death. Now, I can already hear you. Alex, don't be such a melodramatic Hitchens impersonator. God isn't a slave owner. Slave owners don't offer their slaves a chance to access paradise, and they certainly don't give them a choice. They chain them up and whip them into forced labor. God gives his subjects a choice. They're able to follow him or not, as they please. We have to be incredibly careful to unpack the euphemistic language of religion, to understand what the real message is behind any teaching. So, what kind of choice is it exactly that God offers if the consequences of this choice are as severe as the Bible reports? Remember, the choice isn't just follow me or reject me as you please. It's follow me or reject me and be sent to suffer in an unimaginable series of torture for eternity. Now imagine the slaver in the slave trade again. His slave is on his knees in front of the slaver, and the slaver offers him an ultimatum. This is your last chance, he says. I'm going to give you a choice. You continue to work the fields for me without pay, or I'll lock you and your family up and whip you 100 times. But it's your choice. Follow me or reject me, and don't forget to be grateful that I'm being so merciful as to offer you the choice. Clearly, this is a grotesque form of slavery, and there is no choice. And in fact, imprisonment and 100 lashes is nowhere near as bad as the torments of hell. All this is to say, God is no stranger to the concept of human slavery.
Number one, God did not create slavery, but rather He regulated it. And so, just like there were laws about murder and theft and polygamy and divorce, God knew that the hearts of people were evil, and so He had to establish laws that would regulate slavery.
Okay, stop. Yes, the Bible contains laws regulating murder, theft, polygamy, and divorce. But here's an important question. What are these regulations exactly? Well, let's see. The regulations on murder are don't do it. The regulations on theft are don't do it. Polygamy, divorce, yeah, don't do it. The laws regulating these things were not regulations, but explicit condemnations. Exodus 20:15, for instance, reads, "Thou shalt not steal." This leaves no room for confusion, and I wouldn't dream of arguing that the Bible endorses theft. I'll repeat, the only appropriate regulation on slavery is its abolition. Anything less than this, at the very least, demonstrates that God doesn't feel as strongly about it as He does, say, divorce or adultery. "Thou shalt not claim ownership of other human beings" is nowhere to be found in the pronouncements at Sinai or in any of the books that follow it. Why not?
And so He had to establish laws that would regulate slavery and ensure the proper treatment of slaves.
Ensure the proper treatment of slaves. Again, I'll press this. The only proper treatment of slaves is their emancipation, and nothing that falls short of this. There were no laws making sure that the victims of theft were properly treated. People were simply told not to do it. Proper treatment of slaves is a contradiction in terms.
And so the very fact that there is a law about it at all indicates that God did not approve of it, and it wasn't His perfect will, because God did not establish laws to regulate or limit good, only to regulate evil.
This is quite embarrassingly ridiculous. We know God didn't approve of slavery because He made laws regulating it. Think about that for a minute. During the time of slavery in the USA, there were many laws regulating the slave trade regarding movement, punishment, education, and other treatment of slaves. Does this in any way justify the practice or indicate that the US at the time was actually anti-slavery just because they had regulations? Of course not. Also, let's not pretend like God doesn't regulate all sorts of things that He approves of as well, like worship and marriage and sex and other things which show that God regulating a certain practice doesn't indicate that He opposes it, just that He wants it to be performed in a certain way. Again, what is indicative of Him opposing something is an explicit condemnation of it, which He doesn't provide for slavery, only regulations. And again, the only appropriate regulation for slavery is its abolition. Further, notice the flip-flopping here. Earlier, like we discussed, this guy was saying that slavery in the Bible isn't what it was in the USA. It isn't like the slave trade. The word meant a different thing back then. And this indicated that the Bible does condone slavery, but that that's okay because slavery didn't mean what it does today. But now we're hearing from this guy how the Bible apparently doesn't condone slavery, implying that biblical slavery was the bad kind of slavery as we do know it today. In other words, we're first being hit by slavery is condoned, but it meant something different back then. But when this fails, when someone points out that actually this was the evil kind of slavery, the narrative is completely switched up, and it's instead argued that slavery isn't condoned. This is indicative of that characteristically religious style of arguing that's more concerned with defending its conclusion and saving face than it is with actually analysing the ideas in question. The apologists will quickly change up their argument and subtly contradict their previous thoughts if it means that they can avoid admitting that they might be mistaken, or worse, God forbid, that the Bible might be mistaken. So what kind of slavery are we really dealing with in the Bible? We haven't actually seen any references yet, so let's take a minute to explore what slavery did mean in the Bible and to consider the religious defense that the slavery condoned in the Bible is not slavery as we'd recognize it today. This is a defense that the guy in this video speaks about next, so let's listen.
Number two, the purpose of slavery in the Bible, as we're getting ready to see, was actually designed to help the poor survive, which was the exact opposite of what was practiced in our country for nearly 400 years. This leads me to my third point, which is that in the Hebrew culture, slavery was primarily volitional. So in other words, if a person was too poor to provide for themselves, or if they were in debt, they would oftentimes hire themselves out to someone who was richer who could provide for them or pay off all of their debt. Others would choose to be slaves to ensure that all of their basic needs were met by their master. Either way, slavery in the Hebrew culture was volitional.
Okay, so there's a lot there and there's some level of truth to this, but let's actually analyze one of the most explicit references to slavery made in the Bible to see what we're really dealing with. Atheists are quick to point to chapters like Leviticus 25 to prove that the Bible condones slavery, so let's take a look at verses 44 to 46 from this chapter. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. That last point, by the way, about the Israelites highlights the tribalism of the Bible, since it's condoning slavery, but only when the slaves are taken from other nations. So not only are we dealing with the slavery of any people here, we're dealing with the enslavement of certain nations and races. What was that the guy was saying a moment ago about biblical slavery not resembling that of the US? Keep it in mind. So what else can we take from this excerpt? Well, take note of the language used to describe the slaves. Quote, they will become your property. Even if someone is treated well, there's no excuse for considering a human being as property. One of the many reasons this is such a disgusting practice is that property is inheritable. And as the 46th verse here says, the slaves mentioned in this part of the Bible can be inherited by the children of the original owner. And you can, quote, make them slaves for life. If God is giving the Israelites authority to indefinitely enslave people of other nations and make them slaves for life, these people were not simply workers or in some kind of voluntary dependent relationship agreement. They're not free to leave. This is outrageous, regardless of how they're being treated. But hold on, how then do we explain the verse this guy mentions in his video that suggests that slaves can choose whether or not to leave? Let's look again. But if the servant declares, I love my master and do not want to go free, then he will be his servant for life. I just argued that slaves have no choice in whether to be slaves or not, but this quote from Exodus 21 seems to clearly state that slaves can choose whether to be slaves for life or not. So how do we square this? Well, like I say, this guy quoted Exodus 21 verses 5 to 6, but let's back up a little bit and read from verse 2. We get the following. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything, and so on and so forth, up to the quote this guy used that the slave himself can decide whether or not to be a slave for life. This is the element of truth I was referring to, but pay close attention. These verses are referring specifically to Hebrew servants, not slaves taken from other nations. It's the slaves taken from other nations who are the ones mentioned in Leviticus. So the guy in the video is quoting verses that relate to the, at least partially, voluntary service of Hebrew individuals, not verses relating to the regulation of slaves taken from foreign nations. These, the foreign slaves, are the ones who we should be concerned about. He's quoting regulations about the wrong people. This is a prime example of the Bible being taken out of context. And I don't just mean the context of the time it was written or something like that, but the context of the very sentences within it. This would be like me saying that slavery in the 18th century United States was actually voluntary, because when an employer hired a white employee, that employee had a number of rights to make sure that he was treated properly. We're not interested in the white employees because they're not the slaves that we're talking about. And we're not interested in Hebrew servants because they're not the slaves that we're talking about either. But even if we ignore this and only talk about the Hebrew servants mentioned in Exodus 21, we've still got problems. How were these servants treated? Well, let's take a look at one of these regulations, shall we? Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 to 21. And this verse comes just after the one the guy quoted in the video regarding Hebrew servants. Anyone who beats their male or female slaves with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Okay, so it's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want, and this should only be punishable if the slave dies as a, quote, direct result. If they get up after a few days, everything's fine. In what world should we consider this acceptable moral guidance? Even if we grant that the slavery being talked about here is more like a kind of employer-employee situation, this would be an unacceptable way to treat any employee. Imagine if your boss could beat you as much as he wanted as long as you didn't die. It's ridiculous. You, Mr. Video Maker, were the one who brought up the regulations on slavery, and you were the one who quoted Exodus 21 to defend your position. All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime. The regulations of slavery in the Bible are exactly what you'd expect from a book that refers to these slaves as property. They're awful, indefensible, superstitious idiocy that deserve the same historical condemnation as the legalities surrounding the slave trade in the USA. And this is still only in reference to Hebrew slaves. Elsewhere in the Bible, we see what's condoned when enslaving people from foreign nations, such as the Midianites. In Numbers chapter 31, verses 17 to 18, Moses instructs the following: "Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Now, what use could these men possibly have for keeping all the virgin girls, quote, for themselves? I wonder. Why aren't we seeing a defense of verses like this, condoning not just slavery, but sexual slavery? I'll tell you why. Because they're indefensible. So good luck to anybody who tries it.
Which leads me to my fourth point, which is that kidnapping, according to Exodus chapter 21, in any and all circumstances was completely and totally outlawed and punishable by death. And so this idea that you could take somebody against their will and make them your slave was not only against the law, but it was outside of the will of God.
Okay, this all depends on translation. This guy seems to be using the New International Version of the Bible. But, for instance, the King James Bible, in the verse just quoted, doesn't say that you can't kidnap people, it says that you can't stealeth them. I'd wager that it makes little sense to outline all of the regulations on slavery that we've just talked about in the Bible, and then say here that you can't take slaves. Because of this, it seems that this verse is saying that you can't steal a man who is either rightfully free or who belongs to somebody else already. Why else would there be so many laws around slavery if there really was just this simple condemnation of it elsewhere in the Bible? Also, we're dealing with an ambiguity here surrounding whether this verse applies to all people or just to Hebrews, since this is preceded by a verse that specifies that it's talking about Hebrews. We've already seen how easily God can condone kidnapping people from other nations, especially conquered nations, and not just for employment, but for something as trivial as carnal desire.
Number 5, slavery was limited to just 6 years, and so the idea here is that it was never God's heart for the rich to overtake or control the poor. On the contrary, this system was set up so that slaves or people who were in debt could work off their debt in a safe and loving environment.
Safe and loving environment. Okay, so it's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want, and this should only be punishable if the slave dies as a, quote, direct result.
A safe and loving environment.
Mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want.
And then after 6 years, they were not only to go free, but also the master was commanded as an act of kindness to put something in their hands and send them on their way, which was in direct contrast to what has been practiced in our country.
Okay, so now we're quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 15, and once again, this guy has omitted the verse that comes just before this one about freeing slaves. So, for your convenience, here's the full quote. You're welcome. "If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free, and when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed." So once again, this verse tells us that these regulations are talking about Hebrew servants specifically. Not only that, but we're specifically talking about servants who, quote, sell themselves. So not the inherited slaves we were talking about earlier. Again, what we're seeing here in this guy's video is shallow reference to a few Bible quotes that aren't even talking about the slaves we should be concerned about, but specific types of people with specific servant arrangements.
Number 6, slave owners were to treat slaves with respect. The Bible says in Leviticus chapter 25 that slave owners were commanded to treat slaves as employees or hired workers in terms of the type of work that they gave them.
Okay, time to see how you're doing. Let's have some viewer interaction. It's your turn. Can you guess what we'll find if we look at the verse that comes just before the one that this guy just quoted? I'll give you a second. Ding, ding, ding. Well done. We're talking specifically about Israelites. Oh, wait, no, sorry. The Bible doesn't specify that it's talking about Israelites in the preceding verse, because it does so in the exact verse being quoted. This makes me really believe that we're dealing with purposeful obscurantism here. Here's the full verse. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers. So we're seeing a rather boring trend here, which is, once again, picking Bible verses that are referring to the wrong people.
Not only this, but if a slave owner was guilty of killing a slave, he would be facing severe punishment himself.
So he just put up on the screen the verse we were talking about earlier about punishing slave owners who beat their slaves to death. But surprisingly, he fails to highlight that there's no punishment if the slave manages to get up after the beating. I wonder why this might be. And the rest of this segment of the video follows the exact same trend, quoting verses about Israelites who voluntarily sell themselves instead of the foreign slaves mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. The link to the original video is of course in the description if you don't believe me. I just don't want to bore you.
And number 7, slavery was never based on race. And so nowhere in the Bible does it condone enslaving a race of people, rather only individuals, and that on a voluntary basis.
Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. I mean, it's literally written in black and white. And this verse is followed by the command not to do the same with the Israelites, again highlighting that the slaves we should be concerned about are not the ones that this guy keeps trying to use to defend his position. A verse that says, take slaves from other nations, but not from yours, is inherently racist. There's no way around it. But let's be more explicit. I referenced this earlier, this chapter, but go ahead and read chapter 31 from the book of Numbers. In the New International Version of the Bible, this has a subheading that reads, Vengeance on the Midianites, and tells of how God instructed Moses to slaughter the Midianites and to take their women as sex slaves. This was a conquest based entirely on race. I would have said how amazing it is that the guy in this video I'm responding to didn't seem to notice the racial basis to slavery in the Bible in stories such as that of the Midianites. But on second thought, it makes perfect sense since he's only choosing to read verses referring to Hebrew servants, not to racist slave-taking mentioned elsewhere. So in summary, my video today serves two purposes. First, I obviously hope to have shown you that slavery is in fact condoned in the Bible, and it's not some nice kind of slavery if there can even be such a thing. But second, I think this serves as a demonstration of just how important it is to contextualize biblical injunctions. When someone shows you a verse that seems to be anti-slavery or something like that, just take a minute to read the sentences surrounding it. Sometimes it's as simple as that. And likewise, don't go throwing around Bible verses that you think make it out to be an evil book if you're not sure of what context those verses are speaking in. Be careful reading that Bible, it's a dangerous book. I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. Thank you for watching. Check out Stephen's Kickstarter in the description. Follow me on social media, especially on Twitter, where I'm particularly active, especially right now. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.